Hello and welcome to Viewpoint. I'm Volodymyr Solohub. Join me now to discuss the legal implications of Russia's annexation of Crimea as a partner of a Moscow-based law firm and international lawyer, Ms. Maria Issaeva. Ms. Issaeva, welcome to Viewpoint.
Hi, thank you.
Ms. Issaeva, almost 2 years ago, Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine after the so-called referendum which was held in Crimea Peninsula. And up until now, Ukraine has filed several claims with the International Court of Human Rights, there are several arbitration cases. Do you think Ukraine is doing enough on the international legal arena?
Well, obviously, it's a sovereign discretion of Ukraine to decide on which courts it's willing to use. As I saw recently in publicly available sources, Ukraine is actually planning to bring another case, and that's to the International Court of Justice, on the basis of two international agreements, one of them concerning terrorism and the second one concerning racial discrimination, I believe. So it seems that the venues are chosen and something is going on, and the whole situation looks, from a legal point of view, Ukraine is doing what it should. Probably.
Let's talk about this this case with ICJ. Do you think this is effective? Do you think Russia will accept the jurisdiction of the ICJ?
Well, I don't know the details, you see. Depending on, Georgia had a case on the Convention on the racial discrimination. So there was no exhaustion of negotiations provision. As far as I know, Ukraine is doing that now. So there was like admissibility question. Other than that, we'll see.
Again, if we're talking about ICJ, if the case is brought before the ICJ, do you think there will be proceedings? Do you think Russia will accept the jurisdiction?
I think it's, well, basically depending on which particular convention we are talking about. If the admissibility criteria are complied with, Russia will have to appear. But we, of course, as we know from like Nicaragua versus the United States case, for example, there are many, if a state doesn't want to either go or comply with the judgment, there are a variety of options, of course, not to do so. So even if they are brought to the court, or like if we look at the Arctic Sunrise case, Russia refused. There was jurisdiction, but Russia refused even to send representatives to the court. So there were proceedings like in absentia. So it's very difficult. There are many options, of course. Yes, of course there is what is missing. It seems is a political will, unfortunately, to solve the whole situation by legal means. So from that, we can have like a variety of consequences. But you asked about Ukraine, and Ukraine still, is doing what, it should to try to bring it to court.
Mrs. Issaeva, can we go back 2 years ago and talk about the events which were happening in Crimea from the standpoint of public international law? So what was happening there? There were the Green Men, who Russia refused to recognize as Russian regular army, but President Putin consequently said that yes, these were the members of Russian military. Does that amount to intervention?
Well, more than that, on that aspect, Russia explicitly admitted use of force. So what happened is that for the first a month and a half, there was no admission of attribution. So there were some men, as they were called, like green polite, military uniform. But already on the 17th of April, President Putin admitted in one of his speeches that, of course, those were our soldiers. In a year, by the first anniversary of Crimea, he said in an interview for a documentary that he had started a special operation, or he had ordered to start a special operation to take the Crimea on the 22nd of February. And as we knew before, the entering into governmental buildings, it occurred starting 27th. So effectively, the evidence, the statements by Russia's president, they confirm involvement. And once the involvement of Russian soldiers is confirmed, we are speaking about the use of force prohibited under international law and requiring the United Nations Security Council a resolution decision, right? Russia did not go to the UN Security Council, unfortunately, even for any consultation before they did it. So, yes, so there was the use of force.
Well, the use of force, which is prohibited under international law, were there any similar cases in international law where there was such a blatant violation of international law, and by one of the countries who's a permanent member of Security Council? So, what Ukraine should do now?
Well, of course, I mean, there have been a number of blatant violations in the course of 20th century and even after the 1945. Russia is not the first permanent member of the Security Council to violate international law. We all know Iraq and the situation with the United States. What differs, well, to me, as a Russian international lawyer, what I find striking is the reaction. Like, when the United States committed an alleged violation of international law, there is like a public outcry from international lawyers criticizing their own government. In Russia, unfortunately, the number of people who are able or are willing to do that is very limited, as the Crimea, made obvious. You're asking about like similar cases. It's a very.
Mrs. Issaeva, where does this bring then international law to? Does that mean that the powerful states who are permanent members of Security Council can do whatever they want and just go away with it?
I would suggest that we look at the consequences. Russia was subjected to countermeasures, sanctions by a number of states after they did it. Before sanctions, or like at the same time, there was the United Nations General Assembly resolution condemning Russia's actions in Crimea. It was 27th March 2014, and there were 100 countries condemning and many abstaining. So only very few supported what happened. The prior violations, well, if we take the comparison with the United States, one way to put it, they were smarter maybe not to subject their country to that. So in a way, it's very difficult to explain the rationale behind Russia's actions, because while claiming that we are, a very strong state that is able to do so, we don't seem to be able to diplomatically communicate with the world and to engage them in our, plans, in our, basically, we cannot engage them in cooperation on the international level.
Mrs. Issaeva, you just mentioned sanctions as one of the forms of punishment by the international community against Russia, which Russia dismisses. The Prime Minister Medvedev, during the Munich Security Conference, in one of the interviews, he said that these sanctions are hitting the European states more than they are hitting Russia. For you as an insider, can you tell us how significant are these sanctions? How do the people in Russia feel they exist?
So, well, first of all, sanctions, it's not a punishment, it's a responsibility. It's the attempt of the international community to bring a violator to responsibility. Secondly, the sanctions imposed, if we look at the resolutions of the United States, of the EU that impose sanctions, they are very targeted and proportionate. So they are aimed at the person specifically involved giving orders or specifically involved in certain actions and events. What I would say, as a Russian citizen living in Russia, what's hitting Russia more actually, like us, ordinary people, it's countermeasures applied by President Putin in response to the sanctions. So in response to the sanctions imposed on our actions as a state, Russia responded with counter-sanctions, banning imports, like of goods, for example, to the country, which has an immediate effect, of course, on the people. Well, then, we would have to, of course, look on the economic reasons for the collapse of our currency, because that's not doing really well. And of course, salaries, are all fixed in rubles, and the purchasing ability of people is like decreasing.
Yeah, Mrs. Issaeva, my final question. For you as an international lawyer, there were a lot of talks about the possibility of revoking the veto right of Russia or even of all the permanent members of the Security Council. Do you think revoking the veto right, the veto right in the Security Council, again, from the legal standpoint, do you think this is possible? And if so, how will that work out?
Well, from the legal standpoint, it's not possible because the UN Security, the United Nations Charter does not provide for such an option. So if it happens, it is of course hypothetically possible because we are speaking of a community. So law is made by a community of roughly 200 states. If all 200 states agree that they want to change it, why not? But it would be an interesting case, of course, how we do it. But political considerations will be there, and none of the Permanent Security Council members will be willing to give up their veto. But that's not a legal thing, right? So there will be a lot of politics. But of course, it's been the veto right has been criticized heavily by the international legal community, like international scholars, for example. And so, but how to do it legally, I don't know.
Yeah, we'll see how international law develops in this matter. Mrs. Issaeva, many thanks for joining us today. We were discussing the legal significance of the events surrounding the annexation of Crimea by Russia almost 2 years ago with the partner of Moscow-based law firm and international lawyer, Ms. Maria Issaeva. I'm Volodymyr Solohub. Thank you for watching Viewpoint.